First of all, I would like to thank both Victoria Harrison and Jan Kahumbing for inviting me to this conference. I'm much honoured. I've put together a PowerPoint presentation in order to accompany the text that I'm going to read out. This is a sort of a text which is basically a kind of composite of the key elements of this monograph that Jan was telling you about. So I hope it's not too telegraphic, and that it makes sense. And hopefully, with the PowerPoint presentation, it will be all right. All right, I'm just trying to. Is that okay?
Yes.
Cool. So in this paper, I would like to suggest, it's just a suggestion really, I would like to suggest the possibility of rethinking our relationship to time. In doing so, I will pick up one idea from the start of the previous talk by Charles Taliaferro, namely his understanding of the now as an unlivable zeptosecond, or more precisely, a Planck time, which is even shorter. Whatever the unit, my argument for today is to say that our understanding of time remains entirely Aristotelian and Newtonian. The general consensus is indeed to understand time as entirely regulated by its measurement, whether in relation to change, as in Aristotle, or abstracted from it, as in Newton. Time is what offers itself to be measured, and it is through this measurement from Planck time to the super eons that time is conceived and used. Museums, for example, structure their understanding of time through its measure, artworks dates, artist dates, and when the measure is ideologized and therefore historicized, periods, epochs, generations, movements, revolutions, etc. Such a view not only robs time's multifaceted live qualities, it also chains us to a purely metric and logical understanding of time. If I limit myself to human time, then its lived characters are complex. Everyone experiences it differently: gender, race, age, sociocultural backgrounds, etc. And yet, notwithstanding such an extraordinary diversity, calculated perceptions remain paramount, regulating everything as if an unquestionable universal rules that cares little for time's many eddies, pools, and flows. And any psychological interpretation of time, for example, is relegated as irrelevant or secondary. We operate in a calculated horizon structured by only one law, the law of the clock, this odd instrument that measures time in spite of the many variations that are affected, such as gravity or entropy. Such a measured understanding of time also obeys an implacable logic. With clock time, there is indeed nowhere else to go but ahead, that is, to the next Planck time, zeptosecond, second, minute, etc. With clock time, we are giving the tireless repetition of the same, falsely reassuring us that little remains in the hands of the contingent or the unpredictable. Stuck on the same spot, we press ahead as if guinea pigs inside a spinning wheel. Is there a different way of apprehending time? The history of the attempts to provide an alternative to time as measurement, the law of the clock, and the logic of the same is infinite and impossible to summarize either geographically or historically. I started originally sort of making a list of alternatives, but then it became so enormous that, and then it immediately called for, oh, but what about him? What about her? And et cetera, et cetera. So I decided not to go down that route. Amidst this vast and measureless field stand, I suggest, Pyrrho, who, as is well known, is one of the two philosophers who accompanied Alexander the Great in his Asian conquests. He stands in this vast field for his unusual way of apprehending not only reality broadly construed, but also, as I will see, with his disciple Anaximander, the very nature of time. Against the tireless scansion of measured time, Pyrrho and Anaximander indeed suggest that time is air, probably the oddest and most underexplored interpretation of time of the Hellenic period. Can revisiting the few fragments left behind by these supposedly secondary figures of Greek thought help again to renew our understanding of time? This will be the main aim of this paper. While I will not be addressing the theme of memory in museal contexts, I hope nonetheless that the following argument will help challenge the way museums understand it. For I believe that a museum with a more flexible approach to time is a museum better armed not only to untie its notion of memory from that of a measured past, but also to destabilize its notion of projection from that of a calculative future. In order to rethink our approach to time, then, I will explore first Pyrrho's only surviving fragment. I will then pitch it against a foundation stone of our understanding of time as measurement, namely Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction, out of which Taliaferro's Zeptosecond comes from. And finally, I will test Pyrrho's ideas with a contemporary reading, namely that of Quentin Meillassoux. The only surviving fragment, or direct quotation from Pyrrho, is often referred to as the malon, namely no more. However, as will become clear, I want to understand Pyrrho's only surviving fragment, not with regards to its first part alone, no more, and how it was used by later skepticism, but in its fourfold enunciation, thus insisting on the overall rationale for the statement in question. In a summary of ancient Greek books, the historian Eusebius gives the oldest surviving and probably the most accurate version of Pyrrho's sentence. He writes that Pyrrho was known for saying that the things themselves then are equally indifferent, unstable, and indeterminate. And for this reason, we must not trust them, but be without opinion and without bias and without wavering, saying of every single thing that it is no more than it is not, or both is and is not, or neither is nor is not. If one takes the last part of the sentence, we are therefore dealing here with what is commonly referred to as a tetralemma. As a number of scholars have argued, a tetralemma is a type of sentence that features prominently in the logic of India, where Pyrrho's sentence might have originated. It states that with reference to any logical proposition, there are four possibilities: X affirmation, not X negation, X and not X both, X or none, not X either. Neither one of which can be affirmed or denied. If I apply that to time, I would then say that it is now, I don't know, I'm guessing 9:30. It is not 9:30. It is and it is not 9:30. It is neither 9:30 nor 9:30. A tetralemma is therefore understood as a fourfold statement that prevents either denial or assertion in any of the four options put forward. The key aspect of it is to basically call for a temporary suspension of humans' pretensions at articulating both reality and time. We touch here on what is classically understood as a epoche, a suspension of judgment but a rather radical one, namely that things must be apprehended in another manner than with predicative assertions or denials. By foreclosing all logical possibilities, human language is, as it were, called to mark an abrupt pause, as it no longer corresponds to how reality or time occurs. Interestingly, the same idea can be found not in the sayings of the Buddha himself, at least of the gymnos sophists that Pyrrho encountered with Alexander the Great at the time. For example, the Mahayana Buddhist scholar Nagarjuna provides roughly at the same time as Pyrrho's sentence was recorded a number of versions of the Tetralemma in his famous text, The Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way. His first version, for example, states everything is real and is not real, both real and not real, neither real nor not real. If one takes on board this fourfold statement, it becomes clear that it also consists of an admission that when it comes to reality, and as I will see with time itself, nothing can be asserted or denied. This admission is quite a difficult undertaking because it implies, as with Pyrrho, a relationship to reality that cannot be channeled through forms of affirmation or denial, consistent hesitation, no more, paradoxical complementarity, or exclusion. It operates, if it operates at all, in a completely different fashion. Before exploring how the Tetralemma relates to time, let me now explore its supposed opponent, Aristotle, who established and secured forever our way of understanding time. Against these Pyrrhonian ideas, which were lost in time to some extent, comes indeed the opposing argument for which reality and time need to be made into logical, determinable parts. In order to make his argument against anyone, and especially followers of Protagoras and Anaxagoras, who advocates for a type of thought and action arising from statements such as the Tetralemma, Aristotle, as is well known, affirms the principle of non-contradiction as the only unchangeable principle of ontology and logic. Let me quickly look at this famous principle. For the sake of brevity, I only focus on the ontological version. Here it is. It is impossible for the same thing at the same time, both to be and not to be in the same thing in the same respect. As is well known, the principle is the second classical principle, along with the first, identity, and the third, the excluded middle. Because the principle of identity partitions its logical universe into exactly two parts, is and is not, the principle of non-contradiction creates a dichotomy wherein the two parts become mutually exclusive, and that such exclusivity is also an expression of its jointly exhaustive aspects. In what concerns me here, it is important to reflect on the temporal dimension of Aristotle's principle, for it is at the foundation of how we understand time today. Contrary to Plato's own version of the principle in the Republic, Phaedo, and the Sophist, Aristotle starts not from an order of derivation taken from experience, but from an a priori as the fundamental axiom of his analytic philosophy. The axiom requires the principle to establish a fixed and realist model, even if it has no anchor in experience and has no origin in empirical evidence. This means that when it comes to temporality, each component of the principle is ascribed a fixed a priori now point, a nun in Greek, with no future, present, or past anchor. Aristotle's aim is indeed to create frozen, timeless states, somewhat like the figures frozen in action on the frieze of the Parthenon before they were ruthlessly sewn off by Lord Elgin. As Derrida writes, time becomes divisible into parts, and yet none of its parts, no now, is in the present. Aristotle needs to do this because he knows that a flowing, kinetic, or metabolic time cannot be measured. Only what is changeless or atemporal can. In doing so, he logically separates the world of constant change into a formally knowable world of fixed, atemporal entities or now points. It is difficult not to be awed by this, what is probably the most influential of philosophical ideas. But this is not all. In addition to these frozen, a priori, timeless now points, Aristotle adds yet another timeless dimension, with the expression at the same time. The a priori now points are not just confined to the content of the ontological predicate, but the predicate itself is in turn dependent on another frozen time. The use of the expression at the same time indeed highlights a time that is neither empirical nor psychological. Just the predicate, in this way, just that the predicates is and is not themselves, the logical initiation equally rests on a time that is not one, strictly speaking. With Aristotle, time becomes therefore alien to any mortal being and how such a being expresses him or herself. Empowered with such a view, Aristotle thus becomes stronger than time, as Levinas would say. He becomes Father Time, smoking a pipe as in this Hogarth hedging, able to single-handedly make sense of what takes him aware. His neat separation into fixed, timeless, and therefore measurable times gathers the dispersal of temporal shades, flows, and courses under the sovereign unity of a dogmatic logic qua logic. In doing so, time becomes both abstracted and shackled to the logic of a division and measure. One now time becomes mutually exclusive, another now time, in exactly the same way that is and is not mutually exclude one another. Such an abstracted, non-empirical, non-experiential understanding of time gives us, as stated in the introduction, time as measure, the law of the clock, and the logic of the same. With Aristotle, time enters its utmost rationalization, one that has never been challenged, because it adheres to a sphere of logicity that is posited as an absolute and unquestionable a priori. Most crucially, Aristotle time paves the way not only for Newton absolute mathematical time, but also to all forms of historical determinism, for which the measurement of time becomes the only decisive factor in articulating human and universal affairs. Think of Hegel, Marx, but also astrophysicists. Without Aristotle's logical parceling of time into measured, unlivable, non-contradictory now points, human and universal history could not be narrated and therefore, most importantly, ideologized. As mentioned earlier, museums are also emblematic of this spatial configuration of this non-empirical and non-experiential understanding of time, with its ubiquitously dated rooms, halls, and gallery. Even the most seemingly egalitarian flea market style museum project, such as Lino Borbardi's Modernist Triumph, cannot avoid falling for a chronological order. This short excursion into the ideas of Pyrrho's supposed opponent slowly unveils in all its troublesome splendor the temporal radicality of the tetralemma. The tetralemma indeed opens the possibility of apprehending reality and subsequently time itself in ways that are unstained by human logic and accountability. But how does this work? This is where I propose to sort of move on to Anaximander, his disciple, Pyrrho's disciple, who perceives time differently. By way of a critique of dogmatist ideas about time, Sextus Empiricus, the late skeptic who lived 500 years after Pyrrho, provides us against the physicist with what is perhaps the most puzzling of Anaximander fragments. In a passage on the existence of time, he writes that for Pyrrho's disciple, time is air. The time is vitally different from air, and just as nobody says that fire or water or earth is time, so for the same reason, nobody will say that time is air. If one sets aside for a moment Sextus' dismissive critique and pay attention to Anaximander' idea, then something rather unusual it gets revealed. First, let me sort of discard one easy misconception. The idea that time is air must not be perceived as if equating a temporal dimension with one of the four elements often found in Greek thought, namely earth, fire, water, and air. If this were the case, then in Sextus' dismissal is indeed right on point. However, there's something distinctive about air that not only marks it out from the other three elements, but also distinguishes it as indeed curiously similar to time. Firstly, air, like time, is mobility itself. It is always active and dynamic. Unlike the dust it carries, air itself never settles. Unlike the fire it fuels, air neither burns rapidly nor extinguishes itself. Unlike the oceans it moves, air neither breaks into waves nor is waveless. Its radical mobility not only marks it out from the other three elements, it also makes it difficult to make sense of, just like time evades all human attempts to logically parcel it out into neat now times. Another key aspect of air is that again marks it out from the other elements and makes it comparable to time, is the fact that being absolute mobility, it stands for freedom itself. As Bachelard says, natural air is free air. This is something difficult to articulate because human logic is always conditioned by form and therefore by the opposite of freedom. Language coerces air into comprehensible aerological frames: temperature, pressure, humidity, precipitation, velocity, etc. If time is indeed air, then it can only really be understood through the prism of a meteorology. That is, through the prism of a science that isn't one, strictly speaking. Within the context of Pyrrho's thought, a meteorology is not to be understood firstly in an Aristotelian sense, namely as an all-embracing natural philosophy that includes branches such as astronomy or geography. This meteorology is also not to be understood as a theory of exaltation from which cloud and rains are formed. If this were the case, then their understanding of time would be reducible to a forecasting of the weather. This meteorology can also not be confused with a thought that amalgamates air with soul or breath, pneumonia, as advocated, for example, by Diogenes, who took the air we breathe to be identical with the soul. The meteorology must not also be perceived as if defending the thesis familiar to other pre-Socratics, namely Anaxagoras, who says that everything in the universe is subsumable to an originating ether. This meteorology concerns air irrespective of any cosmology or cosmogony. And finally, such a restlessness cannot also be articulated as a type of metaphysical movement, as advocated, for example, by Hildegard of Bingen in his vision of the macrocosm of winds influencing the microcosm of the humus. Anaxima's statement, time is air, announces a meteorology as in the sense of a theory of the ceaseless. From the Greek meteorologia, the logic of the atmosphere, the word indeed means the articulation of that which always changes. Such a restlessness shows that a meteorology can never be pinned down by any logical motions, winds articulated in relation to their cardinal province, for example. So to say that time is air is to say that time is what is prone to a meteorology that is to the unpredictability of change. This unusual understanding of time has the advantage of freeing time from the shackling constraints of human logic, namely from the punctual and causal confines of both now times and sustained durations. With Anaxima's, we suddenly live in an unstable time that knows no number, neither that imposed by change nor that imposed onto change. The crucial thing for us in this new understanding of time as air is that nothing can be considered as a fixed entity amidst time. No master, such as Aristotle, can indeed stay afloat mid-air, wisely contemplating the temporal atmosphere around it, as if an immobile lord subjugated to no movement whatsoever and ascribing a human logicity onto what suffers none. Time as air wipes out any a priori stability, it impairs all forms of endurance and shatters any timeless logical anchor, call it being or becoming. This is where we must now return to the tetralemma. Applied to time, the tetralemma can here be phrased anew. The present is no more than is not, both is and is not, is neither than is not. However, this does not privilege the present over other temporal dimensions. Past and future equally dissolves in the crucible of this turbulent time that does not give the possibility of determining what has passed from what is to come. With Pyrrho's tetralemma and Anaxidemus' all too brief remark, time is finally giving its due, not as the equivalent of change, as the pre-Socratic envisaged it, but as what abides to a logic that has no logic in human terms. As the eminent philosopher Marcel Conche astutely puts it in a commentary on the same fragments of Pyrrho and Anaxidemus, time is indeed what is utterly illogical. It goes from here to there like a child, incapable of seeing the whole and unable to determine who's strongest. In this permanent state of unrest, humans can also no longer pin time, i.e. what is ceaseless, to an external timeless referent, calling it stealthily at the same time, like in Aristotle, or more commonly, eternity, there-ness, or the radically other. When there is no more ground, when there is no more subject, falsely lording over time, and when there is no outside of time underpinning time's passing with eschatological promises and or shot through by messianic chips, then every being and thing are swept away in the unstable whirlwind of both time and air. To finish, I want to now read a contemporary interpretation that also aims to free time from measure, but takes on a radically different perspective. This interpretation is that of Quentin Meillassoux. Against most thinkers of time who tie time to either the law of finitude or that of a future never future enough, Meillassoux wants to think of time as only abiding to the principle of non-contradiction. However, instead of establishing the basis of Western temporality, namely a timeless now point as differentiated from another timeless now point, the principle becomes in his work structured by a now point as pure chaos. In order to think this, Meillassoux needs to begin with a type of reasoning that would be free from all principle of reasons, because that would laden him with a causality incompatible with the kind of chaos he's identifying at the epicenter, as it were, of the non-contradictory. Apologies for the long quote, but I'll read it quickly. I would like to suggest thinking a time that would be ruled by no law, not even the law of disorder or that of a future to come, always to come. One law, however, must remain, the principle of non-contradiction. When I speak of a reason emancipated from the principle of reason, I'm referring to a reason that would be able to conceive a type of chaos that would be so chaotic that it would even be capable of order, the most desperate consistency, the most joyous immortality. The dialectical trajectory I'm trying to identify is thus this: is it not possible to conceive the emergence of the sovereign principle of non-contradiction out of this chaos? The aim would then be not to pitch the principle of non-contradiction against chaos, but to propose that the principle of non-contradiction results from chaos. This daring new idea reverses the tables of everything that has been established about time since Aristotle. Meillassoux' aim is indeed to pitch the fixity implied in the principle of non-contradiction as chaos itself. So how does he justify such a bold idea? Everything hinges on the belief that there is such a thing as a single entity that is non-contradictory, is or is not, and that in order to be or not to be, such entity sustains itself as chaos. Meillassoux goes to great length in a number of iterations to explain this single non-contradictory entity, interpreting it, for instance, from a semiotic perspective by calling it a sign devoid of meaning, or an empirical one by famously referring to pre-linguistic signs found in archaeological digs. Whatever example he puts forward, the general idea is that what is non-contradictory cannot sustain itself in a state of contradiction, the same and the other together without outside. Instead, the non-contradictory is the condition of the hyperchaotic. The sign devoid of meaning is, or is not, is now finally free from becoming pure chaos, expressing itself as such. The problem with Meillassoux is not only that he embraces an isomorphism of thinking and being, but that he imposes a logic in a situation where only the turbulence of doubt can be expressed to explain the absolute absence of reason for anything. This does not mean to say that the only thing there is a Pyrrhonian form of skepticism, but it is to say that in the end, hyperchaos itself can only rationally express itself as an aporia in which knowledge modestly and perhaps most happily flounders. To not admit the blunt fact that reason needs to also be stomped by hyperchaos in order to express itself in not all its unreasonable consistency is to foolishly fall, as Nietzsche's so rightfully thought, for regulative articles of belief. Ultimately, the only thing that Meillassoux does is, like Aristotle in his time, to dogmatically impose himself as yet another lord of time, a new father time, able to see speculatively what cannot be expressed. As Nietzsche says, the law of non-contradiction is the greatest error that has ever been committed, the essential fatality of error on earth. One believed one possessed a criterion for reality, of reality in the form of reason, while in fact one possessed them in order to become master of reality, in order to misunderstand reality in a shrewd manner. And behold, now the world become false, and precisely on account of the properties that constitute its reality, change becoming multiplicity, opposition, contradiction, war. So Meillassoux' speculative attempt to pitch hyperchaos as the condition of what is non-contradictory might give us a different take on time, but also, unfortunately, one that cannot be enunciated in the way that he does. Hyperchaos cannot indeed be riveted as a condition. If it is truly as chaotic as Meillassoux claims it to be, then it cannot indeed survive any principle whatsoever, not even that of simply being or not being non-contradictory. To paraphrase Hume, even hyperchaos is always too strong for principle. Nearly 2,400 years before Meillassoux' bold speculation, Pyrrho and Anaximander already understood this. With time as air, and above all with the tetralemma, all principles flounder, for they are nothing more than regulative articles of belief that some things, hyperchaos, happen to be temporarily perceived by humans as all too rational evidence of the unreason that makes them non-contradictory. In such a gusty and motionless context, only the tetralemma, with its unprincipled illogicity, can truly account for it, because it moves us beyond the state at which logicity, speculative or not, left us stumped and always too late. To conclude, my questions are perhaps these. If all is air, do the laws of finitude and of the to come disappear? Is the radically other no longer lurking beneath and or surprising anything whatsoever? And is death no longer a thief in the night? The law that Meillassoux rails against, because they do not satisfy his imperious rationality, are simply that, laws, temporary laws that obey only fleeting principles of sufficient reason and non-contradiction. We might not be able to overcome the grim reaper. We might not be able to guess further than tomorrow. And we might not be able to extricate ourselves from either becoming or difference. But these are only provisional conditions that we turn into laws simply to make sense of ourselves and of our immediate world that surrounds us. The same goes with time as measure, time as clock, and the logic of the same. However, the great potential of revisiting Pyrrho and Anaxima's idea is precisely to reveal the arbitrary nature of these ideas, to reveal that dates are not necessarily valid for all times, that objects are not necessarily of a set period, and that epoch are not necessarily framed by efficient markers. Time as air warns us of these false ideas and opens up the possibility to what suffers no measure, to what is inconceivable now or tomorrow. Who knows if one day we might indeed accomplish, for example, Nikolai Fedorov's common task, allowing us to resurrect all the dead and, outside of all earthbound particularism, self-design humanity by coalescing all past and future human endeavors so as to achieve a cosmism on a scale hereto unimaginable. Who knows indeed? Our aerial temporality does not generate absurd miracles or delusional fantasies. It only proves that nothing, not even non-contradiction, can determine anything whatsoever. Our freedom is as radical as any global winds resulting from the clash between solar flares and the Earth's climate, to say nothing of galactic or universal ones. To see or hear this, we simply need to recall the tetralemma and remain silent, mere acts that accord with difficulty without cherished propensity to tirelessly bring everything under the rule of some punctual or timeless law or principle. Thank you very much.